There was a meeting. That is what I call it now. A meeting. Though at the time nobody used that word. It was a Sunday lunch that turned into something else. We were all there. Ray, my husband of 50 years, at the head of the table as he has always been. Our son Peter and his wife Joanna. Our daughter Susan and her husband Mark. The grandchildren had been sent upstairs after dessert. And then the conversation shifted. The way conversation shifts when someone has been waiting for the right moment. And Peter said, "We should probably talk about the future." I looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the ring left by someone's cup that I had been meaning to polish out for weeks. Ray said, "Yes, I think it's time." Oh. What followed was 45 minutes of my family discussing my future, where I might live, what kind of support I might need, whether the house was still manageable, whether there were places, good places, comfortable places, places with activities and people my age, that we ought to be looking at together. They were kind. They were thorough. They loved me. I could see all of that. Peter had clearly done research. He mentioned specific facilities, specific arrangements, spoke about costs and waiting lists with the calm competence of a man who has done his homework. Susan asked questions that showed she had been thinking about this for some time. Ray nodded and offered information and occasionally reached across and put his hand over mine. And I sat at the table and I looked at the grain of the wood and I said nothing. Not because nobody invited me to speak. Peter said, at one point, "What do you think, Mom?" Then Susan said, "Mom, what matters most to you in all of this?" And I looked up, and I opened my mouth. And something happened that I had not expected and could not have predicted. Nothing came out. Not the stun nothing of shock. Not the nothing of someone who needs a moment to gather their thoughts. A different kind of nothing altogether. The nothing of someone who has been silent for so long that the words, when finally needed, cannot find their way to the surface. Like reaching for something in a dark room and not being sure anymore exactly where you put it. Reaching and finding only air. I said, "Whatever you all think is best," and they nodded. And the conversation continued around me. I sat in that chair for the rest of the discussion and I thought, this is what it costs. This is the bill that arrives after a lifetime of keeping quiet. You keep quiet long enough and eventually the quiet keeps you. My name is Selena. I am 73 years old. And I have been quiet for most of them. Let me tell you how that happens. Let me tell you how a person loses their own voice without anyone taking it from them. Without anything dramatic happening at all. I was born quiet. Or rather, I was made quiet. There is a difference, though it takes many years to understand it. I was the third of 4 children in a household where the rule, spoken and unspoken, was that children were heard only when necessary. My father was a formal man, not cruel, not cold, but formal in the old way, the way of a generation that believed in order and hierarchy and the appropriate place for each thing and each person. Children were below adults. Women, in most situations, were below men. These were not spoken policies. They were simply the weather of the house. You did not argue with the weather. You dressed for it. My mother was a gentle woman who had adjusted herself to the shape of the house over many years, the way water adjusts to the shape of whatever contains it. She loved us in a particular way of women who have learned that love is best expressed quietly, through presence, through small attentions, through being reliably there without demanding anything in return. I watched her for 20 years. I absorbed what I saw. At school, I was the girl who knew the answers but rarely raised her hand. Not because I was uncertain. I was frequently certain. But raising your hand felt like inserting yourself, and I had been taught, in the particular way things are taught without words, that inserting yourself required justification, that speaking up needed to earn its right. I sat in classrooms for 13 years and watched other children speak freely, opine boldly, argue without apparent fear of being wrong, and I marveled at them privately and said nothing publicly and got excellent marks on my written work, where nobody had to watch my mouth open. I was good at writing. That matters, for what comes later. I met Raymond when I was 23. He was 26. He was unlike anyone I had spent time with before. He talked, not emptily, not to fill silence for the sake of filling it, but freely and fully and with the genuine pleasure of someone who finds ideas interesting and wants to share them. He had opinions about everything. History, politics, films he had seen, books he had read, the best route to take through the city on a Tuesday. He expressed all of these opinions without apology and without hesitation, and sometimes without being entirely right. And he had the further quality of not minding when he was wrong, because for Ray the conversation was the point rather than the winning of it. I found him extraordinary. I still do. He found me, he said once, a very good listener. He said it as a compliment. I received it as one. I did not examine, at 23, what it meant that the quality he most valued in me was my capacity to receive rather than to give. We married in 1974. We were happy. I want to say that clearly, because nothing in what follows should suggest otherwise. We were genuinely happy. Ray is a good man. A love good man. A present good man. A man who fills every room he enters with his particular warmth. He never told me to be quiet. He never needed to. I was already quiet. I had been quiet for 23 years before I met him. He simply continued to be himself. Big, expressive, certain. And I continued to be myself. small, receptive, silent, and we fit together the way two pieces fit when one is convex and the other's concave. Perfectly, without question, and without, for 50 years, either of us examining what that shit cost the smaller piece. We had 2 children. Peter came first and he was light gray from birth. Opinionated, confident, comfortable in the world. Susan came 2 years later and she was more like me. Quieter, more watchful. I worried about Susan in a way I did not worry about Peter, for reasons I could not then have articulated but which I understand now. I recognized in her the particular quality of someone learning to make themselves small, and I knew, somewhere deep and uncomfortable, that I had been the model for that learning, that she had watched me adjust to the shape of the house and was doing the same thing. I never said this to anyone. It went into the journal. I had kept a journal since I was 14 years old. It was the place where my voice lived. The real one. The full one. The one that had opinions about things and feelings about things and questions about things that the quiet exterior had never been given room to express. Every day for nearly 60 years, I had written in a journal. Nobody knew about the journals. Not Ray. Not Peter. Not Susan. I had never hidden them exactly. They sat on a shelf in the small study that was technically shared but which was, in practice, mine because Ray had the living room and the garage and the study had a good north-facing light that suited reading and was too quiet for him. The journals sat on that shelf and nobody ever asked about them, because nobody had learned to ask Alina about things that were hers. 50 years of journals. 50 years of the voice that never quite made it out of my chest. In the journals, Alina had opinions, had arguments, had days of anger and days of joy and days of noticing things that she could not say out loud because the moment had passed or the room was Ray's room or the thought was too tender to expose to the weather of other people's reactions. In the journals, Alina existed fully. Outside the journals, she existed mainly as a support system for other people's existence. We had a good life. I am not saying we did not. We had a very good life. Ray's work went well. The children grew up into competent adults with their own families and their own lives. We had grandchildren, 4 of them, and I loved them in a particular way of grandparents for whom the grandchildren are both continuation and consolation. The house was warm and well run and people liked to visit it. I made sure of all of that, silently, consistently, without needing acknowledgement and without receiving much. And then we arrived at the age I am now. 73. The age at which families begin to talk about the future in that careful, loaded way. The age at which children look at their parents and begin to see, underneath the familiar faces, the outline of something that will eventually require management. The age at which Peter did his research and Susan asked careful questions and Ray nodded and I sat and looked at the grain of the table and said, when invited to speak, whatever you all think is best. After the Sunday lunch meeting, I went to my study. I closed the door, which I rarely did. Closing the door felt too pointed, too much of a statement, and I sat at my desk and I opened the journal I was currently writing in. October. The journal I had started in September and which would last, at my usual rate, until around February. I wrote for a long time. I wrote about the meeting. I wrote about Peter's research and Susan's questions and Ray's hand on mine. I wrote about whatever you all think is best and how the words had come out before I could stop them. Not because anyone forced them, but because they were the words that my mouth had learned to produce. The words I had given so many times and in so many contexts that they had become automatic. A reflex. The verbal equivalent of flinching. I wrote about how I had felt to be asked what I thought and to find, for the first time in my memory, that I genuinely did not know. Not because I had no thoughts. I have always had thoughts. The journals are full of them, but because the distance between what I thought and what I said had grown so large over so many years that I could no longer reliably cross it in real time. The bridge was there, but it had not been used in so long that I was not certain, in the moment, whether it would hold my weight. I wrote. I think I may have lost access to my own voice. Not lost it entirely, but lost easy access to it. The way you lose easy access to a room, you stop going into it. The door is still there. The room is still there. But you have to make a deliberate choice to open it. And the deliberateness itself feels like an event. I sat back and I read what I had written. And then I wrote. I wonder if Ray knows who I am. I looked at that sentence for a long time. Because the honest answer, when I searched for it, was, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that Ray, who has sat across from me at a table for 50 years, who has slept beside me in the same bed for 50 years, who knows the sound of my cough and the particular way I drink tea and every external habit of my existence. I am not sure that Ray knows what I think about most things. Not because he is not curious, but because I have never made my thoughts available. I have been the listener for 50 years. The thoughtful, receptive, present listener. And Ray has never had reason to wonder whether there was more, because I had never given him reason to wonder. I had never shown him the room. I thought about my mother, about how she had shaped herself to the house, about how I had watched her do it and had absorbed it without knowing I was absorbing it, and about Susan, watching me, learning the same lesson without knowing she was learning it. I thought about what it means to pass a silence down through a family. Not a comfortable silence. Not the warm silence of people who know each other so well they do not need words. But the silence of contraction. Of a person making herself smaller, year by year, until she occupies a space that is much less than she deserves. And then her daughter watching her and understanding her. In the wordless way children understand the most important things. That this is what women do. This is how women move through the world. Carefully. Quietly. taking up a reasonable amount of space, but not too much. Never too much. I closed the journal. I sat in my study in the chair with the good north-facing light, and I thought about the meeting, about the care facility, about the waiting list Peter had mentioned, about the fact that a decision was forming in my family, about the shape of my future, and that I had been present at the forming of it and had contributed to it, the same thing I had contributed to most decisions across 50 years of family life. Nothing. Not because it was not my business. It was entirely my business. My future is, by definition, my business. But because the habit was too deep and too old and too well practiced for me to simply decide, in one Sunday afternoon, to be different. You cannot change a posture you have held for 50 years in a single moment. The body does not work that way. Neither does the self. But something had shifted. Something in that moment of reaching for my voice and finding only air. Something about that experience. The specific quality of it, the frightening blankness of it, had lodged in me in a way that would not dislodge. I was 73 years old, and if I did not find my way back to my own voice soon, there might not be enough time left to use it. The weeks after the meeting were outwardly the same as the weeks before it. Ray read his newspaper and watched his programs and talked at length about things he found interesting. And I listened and responded and was present in a way I had always been present. Peter called on Sundays. Susan came for tea on Thursdays. The grandchildren visited on school holidays, and I was glad of all of it. But underneath the sameness, something was working. Something quiet and persistent. The way a seed works underground before anything is visible above the surface. I began to notice my own silences in a way I had not noticed them before. Not with acceptance, the way I had always accepted them, but with a new attention, a watchfulness. There was a moment at dinner one evening when Ray said something I disagreed with. Something about a program we were watching, a small opinion about a small thing. And I felt the disagreement rise in me clearly and cleanly, felt it form into words, and then felt those words stop at a familiar point and not proceed further. And I noted it. I registered it the way you register a symptom. Carefully, without alarm, but with the understanding that it is information. I started writing differently in the journal. More directly. Less refined. I had always written with a certain care. Even in private, I shaped sentences. I chose words. But I began writing the way you speak to yourself in moments of urgency. I wrote, "What do you actually think about this, Alina?" Say it. Write it down and say it, and start making it beautiful before it has even had a chance to be true. I wrote, "I do not want to move to a care facility. I do not want to move anywhere. I want to stay in this house where I have lived for 40 years and where I know every creak and every corner, and where the north-facing light in my study is exactly the right light, and where the journals are on the shelf, and where I am even in all my silence, at least entirely myself. I wrote, I have never told Ray what I want. Not really. Not with the full weight of wanting it. I have expressed preferences, mild ones, qualified ones, preferences offered with an escape route already built in. I have never simply said, this is what I want, and I want it. I wrote, I'm 73. How much longer will I have the luxury of not saying things? My granddaughter Nadia is 14 years old, and she is, without question, the loudest person in our family. I say that with complete love and deep admiration. Loud in a way of someone who has never learned to be afraid of her own voice, who has never had it trained out of her, who speaks with the particularities of a young person who has been told consistently that what she says matters. She argues. She debates. She has opinions about things that grown adults at dinner tables spend whole evenings circling without arriving at, and she arrives at them directly and without apology. She is Susan's daughter, which means she is half mine. And I look at her sometimes and I feel something that is partly pride and partly, I will be honest, something close to grief. That this quality, this full-throated, unguarded, inhabiting her whole self-quality, had somehow jumped a generation. That Susan, who had watched me make myself small the way I had watched my mother, had nonetheless raised a daughter who did not know smallness. Something had interrupted the lesson. Something had said, not this one. This one will be different. I am grateful for the interruption, even when Nadia is very loud. She came to visit in November. She arrived with Susan on a Thursday and was with us for the weekend. And she spent most of the first day on her phone and most of the second day pacing the living room with a piece of paper in her hand. I asked her what she was doing. She said, without looking up from the paper, practicing. I've got a debate competition next month. The topic is whether individual freedom should be limited for the collective good. I'm arguing for limitation, which I don't actually believe, so I have to find the strongest version of the argument I can. She looked up. It's harder to argue for things you don't believe, I said. Yes, it is. She looked at me. She had Susan's eyes and Ray's directness and something else entirely that was simply her own. She said, You want to hear my argument so far? You can tell me if it holds. I said, Sit down. Then, She sat. She read me her argument. It was good. Disciplined and thorough. The argument of someone who understood the structure of persuasion even when she disagreed with its conclusion. I listened carefully, and when she finished, I told her what I thought. Not everything. Some of it was genuinely good and needed no adjustment. But 2 of her points had logical gaps, and I told her about those gaps specifically, and why they were gaps, and what she might say instead. She looked at me during this. A close, considering look. She said, "You know about arguments." I said, "I know about arguments. I don't always make them." She said, "Why not?" I was quiet for a moment. It was a simple question. A 14-year-old's direct, uncomplicated question. And I did not have a simple answer. Because the real answer was long and went back 50 years and involved my father and my mother and a marriage and a lifetime of choosing silence over speech. I said, practice. Or lack of it. She considered this. She said, debate is mostly practice. That's what our teacher says. It feels impossible at the start, and then you do it enough times and it becomes not easy, but possible. I said, yes, I imagine so. She looked at her paper. Then she looked up again and said, go on. Can I ask you something for the debate? Like, practice on you? I said. Go ahead. She put down her paper. She sat forward slightly, in the way she had of becoming very present when something interested her. She said, okay. Tell me something you actually believe. Not what you think is the right answer. Not what everyone else thinks. What you think. About anything. Just. What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say that? And there it was again. The reaching. The hand going into the dark room. The fingers touching nothing. I sat with her question for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Nadia, to her credit, did not fill the silence. She waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the best thing you can do. And then I said, slowly, I think that people who spend their whole lives listening to other people gradually lose the ability to make other people listen to them. And I think that is a very quiet tragedy that nobody notices until it's quite late. The room was still. Nadia said, is that about you? I said, yes, she said. How late is quite late? I said, I'm trying to find out. She looked at me with those eyes of hers, with that quality of attention that she had, the full body attention that teenagers give to things they have decided are important. And then she said, very quietly for a person who is usually quite loud, you have good things to say. I can't tell. I said, thank you, Nadia. She said, why don't you say them? I looked at my hands. At 73 years of quiet. At all the dinners where I had nodded. All the conversations where I had listened. All the meetings where I had looked at the grain of the table and said whatever you all think is best. I said, a very old habit. Started a very long time ago. She nodded. She picked up her paper. She said, habits can be broken. That's also what our teacher says. Then she looked at me sideways, with something that was almost a smile. She says a lot of things, our teacher. I said, she sounds worth listening to. Nadia said, she is. Most of the time. She went back to her pacing. and I sat in my chair and I thought about what I had just said. The first honest, unrehearsed, unqualified thing I had said about myself in a very long time. Not written. Said. Out loud. To a person who had then heard it. Oh. It had not been perfectly expressed. It had been halting and a little obscure. But it had been mine. Entirely mine. And the world had not ended. Well, later that afternoon, while Nadia was in the kitchen and Susan and Ray were in the living room, I went to my study. I opened the journal, and I did something I had never done before. I read old entries aloud, to myself, alone in the quiet study. I read the voice that had lived in these journals for 50 years. Slowly, as though tasting each sentence. Listening to the thoughts I had written but never spoken. Hearing what Alina sounded like when she said what she actually meant. And it was... there is no other word for it. It was like hearing music you wrote long ago and forgot. Recognizing yourself in it. Thinking, yes, that is me. I am still here. I was still reading when Nadia appeared in the doorway. She had a glass of water and she had come to return a book she had borrowed from the shelf. And she stopped when she saw what I was doing. She said, "What's that?" I said. "My journal," she said. "How long have you kept it?" I said. "Since I was 14, she did the mathematics with a 14-year-old's quickness. She said, 59 years, I said. That. She came further into the room. She looked at the shelf, at the journals lined up along it, several dozen at least, different sizes and colors, the accumulated decades of a private voice. She looked at them the way she looked at things she was considering, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. She said, "Can I read one?" I looked at my granddaughter, at this loud, erect, unafraid 14-year-old who had just spent 2 hours on a speech she would deliver in front of people, who had asked me without hesitation to tell her what I actually thought, who had said you have good things to say. When I can tell. I could have said no. It would have been reasonable to say no. These were private things. 59 years of private things. But I thought about the voice that lived in those journals. The Alina who said what she thought, who argued, who disagreed, who wanted things and named them. And I thought, what is the point of a voice that is only ever heard alone, in a room with the door closed? Read to yourself at 73? It took the journal for 1987 off the shelf. The year Peter was 7 and Susan was 5 and Ray was at the peak of his career and I was in the middle of everything. Managing everything. Thinking everything I never said. I handed it to her. She sat down on the floor of my study, cross-legged, the way teenagers sit without considering whether the floor is comfortable. And she opened the journal and she began to read. I watched her face. She read for a long time. I did not read over her shoulder. I sat at my desk and I looked at the garden through the window and I listened to the sounds of the house. Ray's television in the living room. Susan somewhere on the phone. The particular domestic hum of an occupied afternoon. And I waited. Nadia read without commenting. She turned pages steadily, with focus. She was an attentive reader. I had always known that. But watching her read something of mine was different from watching her read a novel. There was a particular quality to it. A particular quality of being witnessed. After perhaps 40 minutes, she looked up. She said, "Go on. You are funny." I said, "Am I?" She said, "You're really funny." This bit she turned back a few pages, searching. Found the entry she wanted. Read aloud, in a fair approximation of my voice. Ray has declared, for the 14th time this year, that the neighbor's hedge is an affront. The hedge is exactly the same as it has always been. I have decided that Ray and the hedge have a relationship that does not require my involvement, and I am staying out of it. She looked up. "I didn't know you were funny," I said. "I didn't know I was. Either. Not until you said it." She went back to reading. A few minutes later she looked up again. She said, "This one's sad." She read. "Peter asked me today what I wanted to do for my birthday. I said whatever everyone else wanted was fine." He nodded and went to ask Ray. I sat at the table after they'd gone and I thought, "What do you want?" "Elena?" And I didn't know. I genuinely did not know. When did I stop knowing what I want? I looked at her. She said, "How old were you when you wrote that?" I said, 51. She said, "That was 22 years ago." I said, "Yes," she said, "and you still don't know what you want." "Sometimes," I said. "It got worse. When you don't practice something for long enough, you lose the feel for it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that was entirely hers, "I think you should tell them." I said, "Tell who what?" She said, "The family. About the journals. About all of this." She gestured at the shelf. "At 59 years of the journal. They don't know who you are. Not properly. Not the funny part and not the sad part." She paused. "It's not their fault, I don't think. But it's not good either." I said, "No, it's not good." She said, "Mom doesn't know. Does she? How quiet you've been. On the inside." I thought about Susan. About watching Susan quietly adjust to the shape of the house. Years ago, the way I had adjusted. About whether Susan was still adjusting now, in her own life, in ways I had not asked about because I had not been in the habit of asking. About whether my silence had cost Susan something it was not too late to return. I said, "I don't think she does." Nadia said, "Tell her." I said, "It is not easy, Nadia, to say things after a very long silence." It is not as simple as just deciding to do it, she said. I know. But you said it to me. Just now. You said things you actually meant, and they came out and they were good. She looked at me steadily. So the voice is still there. You just need to practice using it. I sat with that. The debate teacher's wisdom, delivered by a 14-year-old in a study with a north-facing light on a November afternoon. The voice is still there. You just need to practice using it. I said, will you help me practice? She looked surprised for a moment, genuinely surprised, the way she rarely was. And then she said, yes. Obviously. So we practiced. Not that afternoon. We talked for another hour about other things, easier things, before Susan called us for dinner. But over the rest of the weekend, in small moments, Nadia would stop and say, okay, what do you actually think about this, about the television program, about the choice of restaurant for Susan's birthday dinner, about the route Ray had decided to take on a drive they were planning, about whether the neighbor's hedge was, in fact, an affront. I answered, slowly, haltingly, imperfectly. But I answered. I said I prefer the Italian restaurant because I like the way they do fish and I have never said so. I said I think the hedge is perfectly adequate and Ray's objection to it is more about the principle of the thing than the hedge itself. I said I would like to take a different route on the drive, one that goes through the village we used to visit when the children were small, because I haven't been there in years and I miss it. Nadia listened to each of these. She nodded. She said, there you go, as though each opinion were a small muscle being exercised. Which, I suppose, it was. On Sunday morning, before she and Susan left, she came to my study. She put the 1987 journal back on the shelf, very carefully, in its exact place. She looked at the shelf of journals. She said, will you keep writing? I said, I will always keep writing, she said. But maybe write less that you don't say and say more that you don't write. I looked at my granddaughter. This loud, direct, opinionated, magnificent young woman who had walked into my study to return a book and had, without particularly meaning to, walked me back to myself. I said, I am going to try. She hugged me, quickly, firmly, in the way she did everything. Then she went downstairs and I heard her voice in the hallway, saying goodbye to Ray, telling him that his argument last night about the documentary had been wrong and she could explain why if he had a moment. Ray laughed. The front door opened and closed. And I sat in my study with the north-facing light and the journals on the shelf and the voice that was still there, waiting to be used. And I picked up the phone, and I called Susan. Susan answered on the second ring. She said, Mom, Is everything all right? That is always the first question. Is everything all right? Because I only called Susan with news, or to wish her a happy birthday, or to relay information. I did not call Susan simply to talk. I had never called simply to talk. That was not the pattern we had established over 45 years of being mother and daughter. Oh, I said, everything is fine. I wanted to talk to you about something. A pause. Susan said, of course. What is it? I said. I want to talk about the conversation we had at Sunday lunch. About the future. Another pause. More cautious this time. She said, Mum, we were only thinking about what's best for I said. Susan, let me speak. Silence. It was the first time, I think, that I had said those words to my daughter. Let me speak. 3 words that I had never needed to say because I had never been fighting for the floor. I had always ceded it without a fight. And now here they were. In the air. My words. Susan said, quietly, okay. Mum, I said, I do not want to move to a care facility. I want to stay in this house. I know that may require some help. More help than I currently have. Perhaps help that needs to be arranged and paid for. But the decision about where I live is mine to make. And I would like, very much, for the next conversation about my future to begin with someone asking me what I want. Not halfway through. Not as a courtesy. At the beginning. Silence on the line. I said, I should have said this at the table. I didn't. I am saying it now. Susan said, and her voice was different when she said it. Softer. A little shaken. Mum, I didn't realize you felt so strongly. I said, you didn't ask. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no, I didn't. She paused. I think I didn't ask because you've always said. You always tell us whatever you think is best in me, I said. I know. I've been saying that for a long time. Too long, she said. Why? I said, because I was taught to. And I practiced it until it was habit. And then the habit became me. Or I let it become me. I'm not sure there's a difference. In the end, Susan was very quiet. I waited. I had learned, in 73 years, to wait. But now I waited not from the old accommodation, the reflexive giving of the floor, but deliberately, because I had said what I meant and I was prepared to hold the silence until it was answered. She said, Mum, I think I do the same thing. I said, I know you do, she said. You've noticed, I said. I've been watching you do it since you were small. Watching you watch me do it. And I'm sorry for that, Susan. Truly, I should have been. I should have been a different model. Oh. Her voice, when it came, was careful with something. Controlled but only just. She said, "Where is all of this coming from?" I said, "Your daughter," a beat. "Then, Nadia," I said. She asked me what I actually thought about something, and I couldn't answer immediately. And that frightened me enough to make me decide to start answering. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She does that. Asks things directly. I sometimes find it difficult to answer." I said, "So did I. But it's worth doing." We talked for an hour. The longest unscripted conversation I had had with my daughter in years. She told me things about her own life, the parts of it she had been managing quietly, the ways she had shaped herself to mark the way I had shaped myself to Ray, the particular tiredness of it. And I listened, as I have always listened, but differently. Not with the passive receptivity of someone who expects to give nothing back, with the active attention of someone who intended, when she had finished, to say something real in return. And I did. I told her about the journals, about 59 years of the voice that lived only on paper. I told her about the meeting and the grain of the table and whatever you all think is best and the frightening blankness of reaching for my voice and finding air. I told her about Nadia in the study, reading the 1987 journal, saying you're really funny. Go on. Susan said, "You are funny, Mom." "I forget that sometimes," I said. "I made it easy to forget," she said. "Can I read one?" The journals. Would that be all right? I thought about it. I said, "Not the old ones yet, but I'll start writing them differently, with you in mind. Things I might say to you rather than things I would only ever say to myself." She said, "I would like that." I said, "That evening, I talked to Ray. We sat in the kitchen after dinner. Not the living room, not in front of the television, which was Ray's natural habitat for evening conversation. I said, "Ray, turn it off. I need to talk to you properly." He looked at me. He had been married to me for 50 years. He knew my silences better than anyone, or thought he did, which is not quite the same thing. But he had never heard me say those words. Turn it off. I need to talk to you properly. In 50 years, I had never said that. He turned it off. I said, "I want to tell you something about myself that you don't know," he said, leaner, and the way he said my name, with a sudden alertness, as sitting up, told me that my tone had reached him, that something in it had communicated what the words had not yet communicated, that something significant was coming. I said, "I have kept a journal since I was 14 years old. Every year for 59 years. It's in the study on the shelf. And in that journal, there is a version of me that you have never met. A version that has opinions about things and disagreements with you that I never expressed, and feelings about our life that I never found a way to say. Ray was very still. I said, I'm not telling you this because I have been unhappy. I have not been unhappy. We have had a good life and I would choose it again. I paused. But I have not been entirely present in it. Not in the way I am in those journals. I have been an arrangement of myself, a shape that I learned to make before I ever met you, and that I never changed because it was comfortable and you never asked me to, and there was no particular moment when it became obvious that I should. He said, after a long silence, Alina, I didn't know. I said, I know. He said, why are you telling me now? I said, because I was asked. By Nadia, of all people. She asked me what I actually thought and I couldn't answer. And I realized that if I couldn't answer a 14-year-old, I was in serious danger of not being able to answer myself. He reached across the table. He put his hand over mine. The same gesture he had made at the Sunday lunch meeting, but different now. Then it had been comfort. Now it was something closer to recognition. The reaching of someone who has just understood that there is more to reach for. He said, tell me something. One thing. From the journal. Something you wrote and never said. I looked at him, and I thought about 50 years of journals. About all the things I had written and not said. I said, I have always wanted to go to Japan. For 15 years I have wanted to go to Japan. You always said it was too far and too expensive, and I agreed with you, and I never told you that I thought about it most springs when the cherry blossom is on the news. I still want to go. He looked at me. A long look. And then he said, right. Then we should go. I said, don't be hasty. I'm starting. I'm practicing. He said, you're doing well. I said, it gets easier. Apparently. With practice. He said, who told you that? I said, a 14-year-old. He laughed. Slowly, the way he laughed at things that surprised him. And then he squeezed my hand and said, Ellie, I want to hear more. Whatever you want to tell me. As much as you want. I'm not going anywhere. I looked at my husband, at 76 years old, with his face that I knew better than my own, the face that had always looked about to laugh at something. And I thought, 50 years. We have been together 50 years, and there is still more. There is still more of each of us to know. That, I thought, is not a tragedy. That is a gift. Peter called a few weeks later to suggest another Sunday lunch. To continue the conversation, he said. He meant the meeting about my future. The care facilities. The plans. I said, "Yes, come." But this time I would like to start the conversation. I paused. He said, "Of course, Mum. They came on a Sunday in December. Peter and Joanna, Susan and Mark. The grandchildren went upstairs after dessert as before, and we sat around the table. Ray at the head, the rest around him, and before Peter could open his folder and his research notes, I said, "I want to go first." Everyone looked at me. I had written what I wanted to say, not to read from. I did not read it aloud, but writing it first had made it clear to me, had made the voice available, had built the bridge and tested its weight. I said, "I want to stay in this house. That is what I want. And it is the first thing that should be said, because it is the most important thing, and in our last conversation it was never said at all." I looked around the table, at Peter, at Susan, at Ray, at Joanna and Mark, who sat quietly at the edges. I understand that staying in the house may require planning and adjustment. I understand that things may need to change as I get older. I am willing to have all of those conversations, but they should begin from what I want, not from what is logistically convenient. Peter said, "Mum," I said, "I haven't finished." He stopped. I said, "I also want to say something else. Something that isn't about the house." I paused. I have been quiet in this family for a very long time. Longer than you know, and longer than was good for any of us. I said yes when I meant no, and I said whatever you all think when I had thoughts of my own. And I did it for so long that I became easy to overlook. And you overlooked me. Not unkindly, but you did. I looked at Peter and then at Susan. I am partly responsible for that. I made it easy. But I am telling you now that it is going to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But I am going to start being present in a different way. And I am going to need you to be ready for that. The table was very quiet. Susan said, "Mum," and in the way she said it, just that one word, my name, with everything in it. I heard her. I heard that she understood, that the phone call had reached somewhere and was still reaching. Peter said, more carefully than he usually said things, "Mum, I hear you. About the house." He looked at his folder and then put it aside. We don't have to go through all of this today. Can we talk? Without the plans, I said. Yes. That's what I'd like. And we talked. Not about care facilities and waiting lists and what to do when. We talked about what we wanted. About what kind of old age I imagined for myself, and what I was afraid of, and what Ray was afraid of, and what the children wanted for us and for themselves. We talked about Japan. Ray mentioned Japan, and Peter looked at me with surprise, and Susan said, I didn't know that, and I said, I've been wanting to go for 15 years, and Joanna said, Oh, we went 3 years ago. It's extraordinary. You absolutely must go, and something opened in the room. The specific opening that happens when a conversation becomes real. We talked for 2 hours. The longest, sure Sunday lunch conversation we had ever had as a family. And for the first time in as long as I could measure, I was not at the edges of it. I was in the middle of it, speaking, being heard, taking up the space I was entitled to take. At one point Peter said, Mom, how long have you felt this way? About things, I said, most of my life, in different forms. He said, Why didn't you say? I said, Because saying takes practice. And I got out of practice very early and never quite found my way back. I looked at him. I'm back now. He nodded, and something in his face, my son's face, which I had known for 48 years, softened in a way it did not often soften. He said, Mark, who was quiet and thoughtful, and whom I had always liked better than I had shown him, because I had not known how to show things, not in ways that counted. Mark said, Alina, for what it's worth, I always wondered what you were thinking. I said, Did you? He said, You listened so well, better than anyone I know. I always assumed there was a great deal going on behind it. I said, There was. 59 years of it, give or take. He smiled. He said, I'd like to know some of it. If you ever want to say. I said, Ask me things. I'm learning to answer. I'm 73 years old, and I am learning, for the first time, how to speak, not to speak at all. I have always spoken. I have said good morning and thank you and dinners ready and yes, of course. The social surface of speech, the practical exchange of information. I have done that for 73 years without difficulty. What I am learning is the other kind, the kind that says, Here is what I think. Here is what I feel. Here is what I want. Here is who I am underneath all the years of quiet. It is not easy. I will not pretend it is easy. There are still mornings when Ray says something and I feel the disagreement rise and the old habit reaches for it, tries to smooth it away, tries to say yes or never mind or whatever you think. But I am catching it now. Not always in time to stop it, but often enough to notice it. And noticing is the beginning. Nadia came again at Christmas. She walked in the door and she said, Go on. Tell me something you actually think, before she had even taken off her coat. Her standard greeting. Now, when she arrives at our house. I told her I thought the Christmas film Ray had chosen was 40 minutes too long and should have ended in a different place entirely. And she laughed and said, See? That's the voice, and hung up her coat. Ray and I are going to Japan in the spring. He booked it without telling me, which would once have been fine and which now prompted me to say, "Where, in future, book things with me, not for me." He looked startled and then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry," which are words I have not heard him say with that particular directness very often. He is adjusting too. We both are. 50 years of one arrangement does not become a different arrangement overnight. But it is moving. Slowly. Genuinely. It is moving. Susan calls me now. Not only on Thursdays but on other days too. Tuesdays sometimes, or Sunday evenings. She calls to talk, not to relay information. She tells me things about her life, the real things, the ones she had been managing quietly. And I listen, as I have always listened, but differently. And then I say something back. Something from the inside rather than the surface. She told me last month that she has started keeping a journal. I said, "Good. But write less that you don't say and say more that you don't write." She laughed. She said, "Did you just quote Nadia at me?" I said, "She deserves to be quoted." The journals are still on the shelf. I'm still writing in them. But the writing has changed. It is less a place of refuge from speech and more a place of preparation for it. I write to find out what I think. And then, increasingly, I say what I have found. What I want to say to you all, whoever you are, wherever you are, in whatever particular silence you are living, is this. The voice does not disappear. That is the thing I want you to hold. No matter how long you have been quiet, no matter how many times you have said whatever you all think is best when you had thoughts of your own, no matter how deep the habit runs, the voice does not disappear. It waits. It is patient in a way you may not deserve, given how long you have left it waiting. But it waits. And when someone asks you, really asks you, a 14-year-old with a notebook or a Sunday morning with enough silence in it or a frightening moment at a dinner table when you reach and find nothing. When someone or something asks you, the voice is there, ready. Imperfect and slightly rusty and not as fluent as it would have been if you had used it all along. But there. Yours. Entirely and always yours. The cost of silence is real. I do not want to pretend otherwise. 59 years of a voice that lived mainly on paper cost me things I cannot fully inventory. Conversations I did not have, opinions I did not give, a version of myself that my own children did not know, a marriage that was good and real and that could have been even more fully itself if I had been more fully myself inside it. These are real losses. I carry them honestly. But I am not only the losses. Nobody is only the losses. I am also the journals. 59 years of the real voice. Preserved. waiting, ready to be read, by a granddaughter who finds it funny, by a daughter who finds it recognizable, by a husband who finds it, to his honest surprise, a person he is glad to be meeting. I am also the woman who finally said, "Let me speak," who called her daughter and said, "I have things to tell you," who sat at the kitchen table with her husband of 50 years and said, "Turn it off. Ray, I need to talk to you properly." I am also Nadia's grandmother, which means I am, by some grace I do not entirely understand, the grandmother of a girl who does not know smallness, who walks into rooms and speaks and argues and asks, "What do you actually think?" without fear or hesitation. I do not know exactly how that happened, but I am grateful. Deeply, quietly, newly vocal grateful. I sat in my study this morning, north-facing light, the journals on the shelf, the current one open on the desk. I had been writing for an hour. The new kind of writing, the kind that prepares rather than replaces speech. Ray called from the kitchen. Ellie. Tea, and I called back. I called back, across the house, clearly and without hesitation. "Yes, please." "And Ray? Can you bring the biscuits? The good ones, not the ones you bought last week. Those were not biscuits." Oh. I pause, and then Ray's laugh, the slow, surprised laugh he has for things that are genuinely new. He came to the study doorway with the tea and the good biscuits. He set them down and he looked at me and he said, "You know what? I didn't know you had opinions about biscuits." I said, "I have opinions about everything, Raymond. You just never asked." He said, well, he settled into the chair across from mine. The chair nobody ever sat in because I had always been in here alone. He sat in it like he intended to stay. I'm asking now. I looked at my husband, at his face that always looked about to laugh, at the good biscuits on the desk and the journals on the shelf and the north-facing light and the 73 years of a life that was still, unmistakably, with plenty still to say, entirely my own. I said, "Good. It's about time." And I began.